Thank you, Rick. We are in 1 Timothy again this morning, so turn over there. We will camp out there, and again, as Rick mentioned, that's our goal as we come together, is simply to say, what does the Bible say? So that's what we're doing together, is trying to look at what does the Bible say, and what does that mean for our lives? What does it tell us about God? How does it point us to Jesus? That's what we're doing here. So pretty simple stuff. So 1 Timothy 6, we're looking at verses 3 through 10 today. So have your Bibles open and read along with me. 1 Peter 6, 3 through 10. If anyone teaches a different doctrine that does not agree with the sound words of our Lord Jesus Christ and the teaching that accords with godliness, he is puffed up with conceit and understands nothing. He has an unhealthy craving for controversy and for quarrels about words, which produce envy, dissension, slander, evil suspicion, and constant friction among people who are of depraved in mind and deprived of the truth, imagining that godliness is a means of gain. Now there is great gain in godliness with contentment, for we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. Now our focus this morning is going to be on verses 6 through 10, but we want to set the stage for it by looking briefly at verses 3 through 5. Now the reason we're focusing more on verses 6 through 10 is because verses 3 through 5 really repeat in many ways an emphasis that Paul has had throughout this letter. One of the main thrusts of 1 Timothy is this warning against false doctrine. Against, if you remember in chapter 1, we saw this idea that these false teachers were talking about myths and genealogies and all of these kinds of speculations. Remember that? And now here we kind of return to the same warning. We'll see it again at the very end of the book as well. There's this consistent warning through 1 Timothy against false teaching. And what Paul describes here is a kind of teaching that, one, doesn't match up with the teaching of Jesus, and two, doesn't result in godliness. It doesn't result in God-centered, God-pleasing type of living, right? That's what he says in verse 3. It's different doctrine that does not agree with sound words of our Lord Jesus Christ and the teaching that accords with godliness, right? Instead, these people, instead of this teaching coming from real understanding, it's coming from a distorted understanding. It's coming from conceit, from pride, right? And we could probably all imagine or think of instances where we've seen this, where someone is kind of enamored with their own thinking. They're convinced that they've got it, that they've found the secret, that they've got kind of cornered the market on knowledge, and they end up just ready to talk about what they think they know constantly. And they're always ready to pick a fight. They deny the truth. They end up destroying churches. Now it's interesting, as you look at this phrase, I would just, as a side note, encourage us to apply this to social media. Because doesn't some of this sound like Facebook or Twitter, right? Listen to verse 4 again, where he says he is puffed up, conceit, understands nothing, has an unhealthy craving for controversy and for quarrels about words, which produce envy, dissension, slander, evil suspicions, constant friction. That's so much of our world, and particularly online, in news, social media, and it would be easy for us to apply that to those people over there. But let me encourage us to apply this to ourselves and even to our thinking, right? That as we interact with people, are we reflecting sound doctrine, truth, And I know we all think we are, but or are we reflecting this kind of arguments about words and wanting to quarrel and slander other people and suspicions and evil friction? There is a danger there. Now, when it comes to this kind of teaching within the church, Paul says this is destructive, right? And there are lots of motivations that could go into this, right? For why these false teachers are going this direction and promoting this false teaching and arguing about words and wanting to fight all the time. There's lots of motivations, but Paul zeroes in on one at the end of verse 5. Look at the end of verse 5. They are imagining that godliness is a means of gain. In other words, they're imagining that kind of pretending to be all about God, pretending to live for God, ends up getting them financial remuneration. It ends up making them wealthy. That's what they're imagining. That's what they're hoping. That's what they're thinking that this whole godliness thing is for. The goal of it is for me to get rich. That's the idea. And this is something we see all over the New Testament. When you see false teaching, again and again and again, false teachers are connected with this kind of love of money over and over and over again. Constant. It's interesting that back up in chapter 5, verse 17 and 18, we had this text where we were told that one way of honoring elders, especially those laboring at preaching and teaching, one way of honoring them is to give them money, to show them their value financially, right? But now he turns around and he basically says to those same elders, you might be honored through money, but you better not be in it for the money, right? You better not be in it for the money. That cannot be your motivation to gain financially. So when you think about me gaining financially within this church, I should be able to say to you, if I could, I would do this without pay. If I could. You're freeing me up so I can do this full time, but if I could, I would do this for nothing. That should be my heart in this. Now, as he talks about this potential to make godliness all about getting rich, he really uses this as a springboard to talk about money and contentment and what is truly gain. Think about that question for a second. What is truly gain? What's actually valuable? What is real wealth? When do you know I am truly rich? What is that? Imagine you were living in the South during the Civil War, and in your pocket you had a wad of money, like thick wad of money, right? We all like to imagine this with today's money, right? But just imagine you're living in the South, you have this thick wad of money, and you're just flipping through it. It's 20s, hundreds, just one after another, just this thick old wad. You can barely fit it in your pocket, right? Now you look at that and you're like, this is valuable. This is gain, right? This is profit. This is something worth holding on to. But in a couple of years, your perspective would completely change, right? The moment that the war ended, that wad of money would be worth absolutely nothing. Zero. Nothing. It had no value to it. You would look at it and you say, this is like, I might as well use this to start my fire at night, right? Not that we need a fire at night right now, right? But you get the idea, right? It would just be worthless. Something had taken place that flipped your estimation of what is valuable. And that's the question we want to ask ourselves. This wad of what's valuable that I would pull out of my pocket right now, and I'd say, this is valuable. And I'd flip through this and this, and my car, my house, my things, my clothes, my shoes, whatever it is, those things, flip through those. Does it actually have value? Will it have value 2 years from now? Will it have value 10,000 years from now? What is actually valuable? What is gain? Now, as we look at what this text tells us about what's truly gain, we're going to look at 2 points. Number one, the gain of contentment. And number two, the peril of greed. This passage challenges us with regards to what is truly gain. So first, the gain of contentment. Now, as we saw already, the false teachers were all about financial gain, earthly riches, right? In verse 6, Paul comes back at that, and he talks about what real gain is. And in verse 6, he says, "Now there is great gain in godliness with contentment." So Paul sets up a contrast here. He says, but there is, and it's easy to miss this contrast, but we have to zero in on what does he actually say here. And the first thing I want you to notice is that he says there is great gain with godliness with contentment. So the false teacher said godliness is a means to gain, right? And Paul says godliness with contentment is gain, okay? So notice first that he says godliness with contentment is great gain. Now, remember what godliness is, okay? Godliness is this God-centeredness of our mind, our heart, our lives, and the way we live, right? To where our lives are about Him, worshiping Him, living for Him, pleasing Him. It's where our lives are about God. And he says that when we have that, we're contented in that, with God being our center, with God being everything our lives are about. When we are content in that kind of life and thinking, that's gain. Think about what contentment is. Contentment is this kind of peace and joy that isn't affected by how much stuff we have. It's a settled satisfaction that is independent of how much money is in our bank account. We have God. He is our center. We are His. We live for Him. That is enough. I don't need the money. I do not depend on my financial circumstances for the peace and settledness of my heart. You see this expressed in verse 8. Look at verse 8. Paul says, "But if we have food and clothing, we will be content." Some of you are like, yeah, clothing, like I've got this massive closet and all the shoes and clothes I want, and yeah, I'd be content with that too. But Paul's boiling it down here, saying, listen, if I just have like clothes on my back and something to eat today, I'm good. I'm good with that. I'm content. That's crazy, isn't it? Would you be content if all you had was the clothes on your back and food for today? Would that be enough for you to have this settled satisfaction in being God's and having Him as your center? Would that be enough? Think about that. That's hard, especially when you spend just a day in our like marketing saturated culture, right? Or you just drive down the street and compare yourself to just a couple other people who have nicer cars than you do. Or you just spend some time with your own heart, right? It doesn't take much to be discontent. Notice how Paul gives us some help for this, though, in verse 7. It seems to be referencing Job 1:21. But in verse 7 he says, "For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world." And he's simply reminding us, listen, you didn't come with anything. Nothing you have or will have was like you were entitled to, or you deserved, or came from you. It's all a gift. So hold it loosely, right? And then you won't keep it for very long, right? You can't take it with you. You know, the jokes about, you've never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul, or you think about, the old quote where someone asked about one of the richest men in the 19th century, and they asked his lawyer after he died, how much did he leave behind? And the lawyer said, well, he left all of it, right? It just doesn't last. It'll be gone. You think of a kid who goes to a dollar store and buys a toy. And guess what happens to dollar store toys? They break in about 30 seconds, right? And, if a kid does that a few times, they begin to wise up and say, this isn't going to last. This isn't going to satisfy. It's not going to make me content. Friends, the things of this earth are dollar store toys that aren't going to last. and aren't going to satisfy, right? That's not where we rest our content. If you rest your contentment, your settledness of heart, your satisfaction on the things and the wealth of this earth, no matter how permanent they seem, it won't last and they won't satisfy. That's what Paul's telling us here. Look again at verse 6. So not only are we talking about godliness with contentment, like a contentment in that God-centered life and thinking, existence, but now notice also that he says it is gain. It's not a means to gain. He says that itself is gain. You see the difference there? It's not just a means to something. It is in itself gain. It is in itself valuable. So think about what he's saying. He's saying that when my heart is satisfied in God, when my heart is satisfied with living for God, with Him as my center, when I'm content in that, that is gain. That is valuable. That is to be wealthy. So I could have nothing else to my name. All could be lost. We can see at times, even in the last few months, how fragile our economy is. And some of us have thought through, will I lose my job? What will happen? How will I pay this bill if that happens? This brings it home to say, listen, if I have God as my center, my joy, as my Father, if I get to live for Him and make my life about Him, I'm content. That's gain. That's valuable. That's to be rich. So I can live in the slums of India, and if I have God and am content with Him, I am rich in that. And guess what? That's real life for people. There are people who are living in that. It is better to be satisfied in God and living for Him as our center than to own a house, a beautiful house, or to have amazing vacations, or to have an incredible investment portfolio, or to have new cars, or to go out to eat it all the time, or to just spend without even having to think about it. It's better, it's more valuable, it is real riches to simply be satisfied in God and living for Him. That's hard to believe, isn't it? Real gain is when God Himself is our center. He's the root of real and lasting contentment. I love Hebrews 13, verse 5. Listen to this verse. In the connection here to 1 Timothy, it says, keep your life free from love of money and be content with what you have. For He has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. What's the basis for me not loving money and just being content with whatever I have? Jesus is with me. I can be content. He's with me. I have Him. He is gain. Living for Him is gain. This takes reprogramming our minds, doesn't it? When it comes to what's valuable. I think it takes us reprogramming our minds by holding up riches and just looking at riches and wealth, all those things you want, and maybe you covet a little bit, you envy other people, but you don't really admit it. Hold that up. Just face it. I kind of want that at times. And then hold up Christ. Look at Christ, at His glory. The eternal King, full of compassion and wisdom, just and merciful, patient, full of power and strength, reigning eternally. Hold those things up. Face them both. We need to do that constantly. We need to do that daily so that we know what is truly gain. We must reprogram our minds. We must learn to preach to ourselves. We must catch our hearts as they start to drift towards the things of this world and begin to love riches. Let's actually make God as our center and begin to see Him as gain, great gain. Not just gain, great gain. That's number one, the gain of contentment. When we When we are settled, satisfied in God, and living for Him as our center, that's valuable. That's to be rich, right? Number 2, the peril of greed. This is the other path, the path of greed, of covetousness, right? Greed, according to the dictionary, is an excessive or selfish desire for more of something, right? Usually referring to money, wealth. Covetousness, dictionary defines as an inordinate desire for wealth. In other words, you really, really, really want stuff, right? It's your mindset in life. It's a being driven by a craving for more things. As verse 9 puts it, it's a desire to be rich, right? Did you see that? But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation. Verse 10 puts it in a different way. It says, for the love of money, right? So it's this desire to be rich. It's this love of money. And what's interesting